right, welcome everybody. Hope you can see the slides here. This is Disability as Diversity. So I want to start by just telling you a little bit about myself and kind of how I come to this work. My name is Sam Drazen. I am a former elementary educator here in the United States. I taught for several years, different grades, and left the classroom about, oh my gosh, 6 or 7 years ago now to start changing perspectives and to present on issues around disability and diversity and equity and inclusion really throughout the world in a variety of capacities at schools, at conferences, to parents, to students. I invite you to keep in touch. I've put my email up here on the screen, as well as, encourage you to connect through different social media channels. What is Changing Perspectives? We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We partner with schools to promote social emotional learning and help them to cultivate more inclusive and equitable learning communities for all students. And we do that really in 4 ways. We do that through curriculum, educator professional development, and parent programs. And again, the nonprofit Changing Perspectives, the URL is on the screen. We're also on the following social media platforms as well. So I encourage you to like and follow, and feel free to reach out directly to me if something sparks your interest, if you're looking to collaborate or bring something to a school. But today's presentation is all about the idea of disability as a form of diversity. Oftentimes in life, we're told to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, to understand how they experience the world. And a motto that I've come up with that I really like is that promoting awareness is the foundation for empathy, right? In order for students, in order for anybody to be empathetic, you need an awareness of other people and how they experience the world. And I like to use this house as a way to illustrate that idea. When you build a house, you pour your foundation first, and that's what supports everything else. If we can provide a solid foundation of awareness of differences, in this case, disability, as we move up the stories of the house, as we move through the chapters of our lives, as we have different experiences, we're going to have that to fall back on and be more empathetic. In other words, what I'm trying to get at is that we can't expect people to understand how someone else is feeling, understand how someone perceives the world or experiences the world, positively or negatively, if we don't first have a solid foundation of awareness of who they are and kind of what they're going through on a daily basis. So there's a great TED Talk that I like called "We Are All Different and That's Awesome." And I think for purposes of time, because we got started a little bit late, I'm going to table this, but I encourage you to check it out on your own. And it's all about this boy talking about kind of how each one of us is different and how that's okay. And in fact, how it's actually awesome. But what do we mean when we talk about disability as a form of diversity? I think oftentimes when we think about diversity, immediately we go to racial diversity, we go to ethnic diversity. We often forget that disability is actually a form of diversity that's very prevalent throughout the globe in a variety of contexts and communities. So what I'd encourage you to do, and you can just think about this, you can write it in the chat, you can jot it down on a Post-it note, but I want to just give you about 30 seconds, and I want you to think about what is the first word or image that you think of when you think of disability. So just take a moment to do that. So hopefully you've had time to think about that and jot it down or put it in the chat here in our webinar. I think it's a really important exercise, and I do this a lot when I present to all different groups of folks. Because oftentimes, when we think about disability, we visualize, or the first word that comes to mind is very physical, it's very tangible. It's kind of what we've been conditioned to think about when we think of disability. I know oftentimes when I do this with students, the first thing that they say is the handicap parking sticker or disabled parking space. Like that's what they think of. And so, how do we help individuals move from a very narrow perspective of what disability is to a much broader perspective about what disability is? Disability really is a form of diversity. Diversity includes language, learning styles, family structures, genders, disability, age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic, and cultures. There's so much that could be counted as diversity, what makes us different from one another, the families we've come from, how old we are, what gender we identify with, what language we speak or languages we speak. And so rather than thinking about disability as rather than thinking about disability at the center, let's think about diversity at the center and make disability just one component or one piece of an individual's identity. And really, each one of us has a variety of factors that make us diverse or make us different from one another. Disability is really the largest minority in the world. And what makes disability so unique is that it's the only minority in the world that intersects all of these things up here on the screen. It's the only minority in the world that is in all races, in all genders, throughout all socioeconomic groups. There are invisible disabilities, disabilities that are not apparent when you look at someone, not obvious from the outside. There's also visible disabilities. When we look at someone and we see the way they move or walk or look, it's very apparent that they have some sort of disability or they live with a challenge of sorts. You could be born with a disability, or you could acquire a disability later in life due to an accident, due to an illness. So many different reasons why you could acquire a disability. Disabilities are prevalent in all family structures, divorced families, single parents, all different family structures, all religions, all ethnicities. So I know this is kind of a long list and I kind of just read it out and hopefully I didn't bore you, but the idea that I'm trying to get at is that there's no one type of person who lives with a disability. And in fact, disability is prevalent in all communities, in all groups of people, which really make it the largest diversity in the world. So why do we not talk about it? I want to unpack this idea of invisible versus visible disabilities a little bit more because I think that's a concept that's really important that we think about. So there's some distinguishing factors between these two, which I think makes one easier to empathize with and one that we are more aware of when we think about disability than the other. And you probably know what I'm getting at by this point. So if we think about invisible disabilities are not always obvious. Those could be someone with mental health challenges, individuals who have an emotional and behavioral disturbance, an individual with a learning disability, people who live on the autism spectrum. It's not always obvious, right? So there's a whole bunch of different examples of this. People who live with invisible disabilities can be harder to empathize with. Oftentimes, especially younger kids, we know that they're much more empathetic to their classmate in a wheelchair than they are to their classmate who has some pretty explosive behaviors because of an emotional disability. Invisible disabilities, there's a range, there's a spectrum. People fall on one side or another in terms of an invisible disability that really challenges their daily life compared to others. It affects people of all ages. And it may take someone without an invisible disability time to fully realize what someone's invisible disability might be. We oftentimes have to be more creative with the way that we think about accessibility and accommodations, right? It's very easy to think about someone who uses a wheelchair and what accommodations we might need to create to help them get into a building. But if you have an invisible disability, it's a little more challenging. On the other side of the spectrum, when we think about visible disabilities, they tend to be more obvious at first glance. You look at someone and you can immediately tell that they are a person that lives with a disability. It can potentially be easier to come up with accommodations because it's obvious. You can see what they're struggling with. Visible disabilities you could be born with, or you could acquire later in life. And again, it affects people of all ages. So I think there's value in taking time and kind of unpacking this and thinking about these two sectors of disability. This goes back to kind of another way to think about disability as identity and diversity, right? That previous slide that I showed where we had diversity in the middle and all the different identifiers to diversity. Oftentimes, if someone has a disability, that is their only kind of identifier, right? Especially in schools. The student with this, the student with that. And what we need to do is really think about an individual who has a disability. There's lots of other intersectionalities that make up their identity. And so this is a model that I use a lot in schools when I'm trying to get schools to become more inclusive places and trying to get educators and schools and systems and administrators to think beyond just a student's disability. What are all of the components that make up who this student is as a person? So you might have a disability. Well, what's your race? Are you a parent? What's your religion? What's your socioeconomic status? Where in the world do you live? What language do you speak? So really recognizing that there's lots of different ways in which we make up our identity and that disability is one. And from that, we become a more diverse world. So what is disability awareness? By now, we've talked a little bit about how disability is really diversity because it's everywhere. How there's different types of disabilities, how they cross all intersections of community and gender and race and all of these components of how we identify ourselves to what communities. The other section of this, wow, pretty quick presentation, it goes by fast, is this idea of disability awareness. And this is a lot of the work that my organization, Changing Perspectives, does in schools. What is disability awareness? Well, disability awareness is educating everyone about disabilities. I emphasize everyone because oftentimes people say to me, oh, so disability awareness is just talking with individuals with disabilities about their disability. Well, that's not it. Or people say, oh, disability awareness is talking to students without disabilities about students with disabilities, but they're not in the same room. That's not it. Disability awareness is building awareness around disabilities with people with and without apparent disabilities in the same room together. Disability awareness is not disability advocacy. Disability advocacy is about, equal opportunities and access for people with disabilities. Disability awareness is building that foundation of awareness so we have a greater roof of empathy, to go back to that illustration of the house earlier on. We are stronger when we talk and learn together. The more we continue to segregate, especially in schools, students with disabilities and students without, the less inclusive and the less equitable we're going to become. In order to bridge the gap, we need to have people together. When we do that, it provides a chance to discuss and provides a chance to build connections. It provides an opportunity for students to say, yeah, me too. That's hard for me too. Or for students to go, wow, I didn't realize that. What can I do to support you? There's this stigma around not talking about disability. We've got to change that. When we do disability awareness, it allows individuals with differences to share about themselves. We're moving away from the model of kind of hush, hush, don't talk about it. There's something to be ashamed to. Let's celebrate it. Let's create a safe space about it. Let's give language. Let's give students the appropriate language, person first language to talk about it. And when students with disabilities and differences share about themselves, they gain greater self-confidence. And from that, they gain greater self-advocacy skills. So hopefully, as you can see here, there's win-win-win for everybody involved when we really do this in an intentional way, when we do this in a thoughtful manner, when we do it proactively, we create a structure and a system around it. So how does that look? What do we need to do? And this, I've done this with pre-K all the way up through adults. So this is universal. Well, we need to push ourselves outside of our comfort zone, create opportunities to do explicit teaching about disabilities. How can we do that? We can do that through guest speakers, sharing real life experiences, inviting people in, or people that are in your organization or your school who live with disabilities, empowering them by giving them an opportunity to share. We need to provide experiences for those with and without disabilities to learn about disabilities, whether that's through a hands-on simulation, whether that's through reading a book, whether that's through an activity, whether that's through research. And then we really need to provide the opportunities to reflect. In order to change behavior, which is the ultimate goal, right? We want to create change makers for a more inclusive and equitable world. In order to change behavior, we need to work backwards. Before that, we need to change perceptions and attitudes and stereotypes about disabilities. And even before that, we need to engage in knowledge acquisition. We need to provide that foundation, that awareness. We need to have knowledge about disabilities, change our perception. From that, we can change behavior. And oftentimes, schools and organizations just start with behavior change and want to jump there. And if you haven't done knowledge acquisition, and if you haven't done perception change, it's going to make behavior change all the more harder. So really thinking about kind of doing this in this intentional way through this model. So here's some pictures of some students engaging in some programs. Most of my work is K 8th grade. We do a little work with high school. So these are some students on the top left doing a simulation activity, as well on the top or bottom right. We've got a really amazing guest panel there that happened at a school, and then some reflection illustrations on this bulletin board. But all of these things, again, even though these are younger students here, can really be applied to all ages. I've done all of these models with corporations, high school students. It really varies. So what are some of the outcomes? What are some of the outcomes of this work? I think these are some really great testimonials that we've gotten from students and educators. I'll pause for a moment and give you a moment to read these. But it just shows the power in these really brief testimonials, the power of engaging in this work. Kids are so hungry. Really, everybody is hungry to talk about this because we've been conditioned not to. When we create an opportunity and open the doorway and have these conversations, it yields so much potential for change making, for inclusion and equity moving forward in our world. It's a couple quantitative figures that we've collected over the years from participants. And I think the one on the left is so telling. This is from students kindergarten through 8th grade. 9 out of 10 students surveyed said students in other schools should learn about disabilities. That's powerful. If you have elementary and middle school students saying this was valuable, others should learn it too. I think there's incredible power in that in that fact and figure. Want to end you here with one of my favorite quotes. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. As we think about this, let's really consider how disability is a form of diversity, how disability might actually be the largest form of diversity in your school, in your workplace, in your organization, and throughout the globe. So how do we empower ourselves to stay educated? How do we inspire individuals with disabilities to gain self-confidence and self-advocacy skills? And how do we really empower everybody to be the change makers for inclusion and equity? And I believe that we do that through this concept of disability awareness. So I want to stop there. We only have a couple minutes left, and just provide an opportunity for any questions for you to put them in the chat. This slideshow should also be available on the hub here where you clicked in to join the session. Oh, great. Thanks. Let me just look at these. So Marie, language, that's so important. And I actually just did a whole corporate training all around the language of disability. That's really tricky because the language is always changing. I kind of side on, let's just call it what it is. I think the reason people shy away from disability is because, and for whatever reason, we've been conditioned that disability is negative, it's bad. But I think if we can kind of define what that term means, we can use it in a more positive way. But there's definitely a lot of work you could do around the language in your organization, and also asking folks with different abilities, what feels appropriate to you. So, question about invisible disabilities from Michelle. I think it really starts with, we've got to talk about it. We've got to open the doorway. When I was a classroom teacher, the model, and you probably all remember this in school, right? The student with a disability is sitting there and someone comes in, some interventionist of sorts, taps that student on the shoulder and quietly whisks them out of the classroom, right? Like there's something wrong, like they need to be ashamed. We've got to change that. We've got to celebrate these differences. We've got to empower individuals with disabilities to share about their disabilities, right? I'm someone with a disability. I wear a bone conductive hearing aid. And it wasn't until probably my early to mid 20s that I really felt empowered by that and felt like I could share about that. Thanks, Lydia, for sharing that. Any other questions or comments here in our last couple of minutes? These are really great questions and comments in the chat right now. I think the challenge with this work is it's also relatively new. I think this concept of thinking about disability as a form of diversity and really diving into it is something that we haven't done before, and it really pushes the boundaries of people's comfort zones. And so the more that we as change makers can start to model that, hopefully the more we'll be able to progress moving forward in this movement. Oh, thanks, Lydia. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Feel free to reach out if there's anything I could do to help. I know I think this is called a spark session. 30 minutes goes by really fast. Any other thoughts in our last couple of minutes? Questions, resources? I'll throw my website in here again. I've been trying to post a monthly blog on here related to these issues. All right. Well, I will. If there's no other thoughts, I can. You are free to go on to your next session. Thanks again for being here. Reach out if there's anything I can do to help. Oh, thanks. Thank you. You're welcome. I'm glad you found it helpful. And I believe you can also download the PowerPoint too. So you're welcome to do that and kind of continue to flip through what I had to share. There's a lot here to unpack. We could have done a whole day of this. It's very exciting stuff and really kind of unpacking all of those levels of what makes up disability and how we can use disability as a leverage point for creating inclusion. Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, I've been talking to some art teachers and theater teachers around how do we really focus on that. I know there's several movements right now around disability representation in TV and in the media, and that's a really big hot topic. There's some really good work that's happening there. Well, it's been a pleasure to be here today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and best of luck as we venture out in the world in our change-making missions.